Hi guys, I want to start this video by quoting one of my viewers who has made a great comment under my last video. He's a licensed PhD, a doctor, a psychologist, and he was making a comment about what's going on in Grindavik and with the residents that are suing to be allowed back in the town. So his comment was, and I really want to read this because it's a really great comment. So he writes, grieving process, including reacting to tragedy and loss, includes denial. In the example of Grindavik, I just want to go home, pretend this isn't happening. Then comes anger, frustration, blaming, bargaining. If we do such and such, it will all return to normal. Then comes depression and finally acceptance. And people move back and forth between these steps. And he says, I would suggest that they bring in some mental health professionals to help people make this huge adjustment. So I'm not saying your name because I don't know if you want me to do that or not. If you want to, I'm happy to do it in my next video. It's just, I think this is the truth. Because if you look at what is happening with the residents and what they're demanding, and it sounds, it is a little bit like this. Although some residents seem to have found some closure, but the government is throwing them roadblocks to free from the town and to move away. Some of them have made offers on other homes in other areas. So we will talk about this just in a minute before we get to this. And it's really mind-boggling and really saddening. So everything in this video today is going to be quite sad. It's stories of residents of Grindavik and what they have to deal with, and especially people who live right next to the home that burned down by the lava flow. And I would have never guessed what they have to deal with. Not only their property, but what's inside their home. It's crazy. So stay tuned for that. And guys, before we continue, I'd be very grateful if you could give this video a like, leave me a comment, click the share button, and watch it till the end, guys, to fight off some hostile attacks on my channel. So that would be really good. Thank you so much for that. And now let's continue with the first topic of this video. So let's talk about the fish processing plant VZ again. They have announced yesterday that they would not let go, but take 130 people off the payroll because of what's happening in Grindavik. So these people should get unemployment insurance or something. That was their advice, but they can't pay them any longer because they cannot conduct their business in Grindavik. They have been fighting to do so, but so far nothing has really happened. But he describes the situation as ridiculous, and he says residents and businesses in Grindavik have to submit to ridiculous rules. And now let's look at what these rules are. So he says residents and businesses are overwhelmingly dissatisfied with how the access to the town of Grindavik is restricted. And he says these rules are ridiculous, and the times that they restrict us to save our valuables, it's just ridiculous. And he says the company's future in the town is uncertain, and he fears that development and moving to other places will begin elsewhere. But he says the problem is people don't back out so easily, but once it has started, it's moving, right? He was there at the company today to save valuables, and so salted fish from there was being carried away. And he says just when a journalist had arrived, and he says the salt fish is sent to Reykjavik for desalination before it goes to Cuxhaven in Germany for packaging. And He says they also have installed one of their processing machines in Reykjavik, and he says we're trying to save what can be saved for the Easter season. And he says 2 forklift operators and truck drivers were also employed to get the fish out, and as stated yesterday, they have taken 130 people off the company's payroll. And the company is very concerned about trying to save their fish from the warehouse, because in recent weeks, the company has been given only 1 day to rescue products from one of their warehouses. So he believes that this is far too little and that businesses and residents are not taken into account enough in the actions of the authorities in Grindavik. So what do you think, guys? I think it makes sense what he is saying. And so he also says people are overwhelmingly dissatisfied with this arrangement. He says, for example, I live in the western part of the town, which is so undamaged. Well, it's not so undamaged. It was actually quite damaged by the magma intrusion that happened on November 10th. So I'm not sure what he means. I mean, there are areas that are, but there's these 2 sickle valleys that have formed underneath Grindavik, and the land has subsided there. So there is quite a bit of damage. But he says he wants to give an example of these strict rules. And he says that the other day, the company Vizier got permission for 10 people to enter the area to truck fish out from a warehouse. And so the company has chosen that 8 of these workers would work inside the area. So the idea was that 2 trucks from a transport company would go in at the same time to also help transport the carts, the pallets with the fish. So the company that does the hauling, they had plenty of trucks available at the closing posts of the town, at the checkpoint area where people need to check in to be allowed into town. But only 2 were allowed into the town, 2 at a time. So then he said, then we suddenly heard that it had to be the same drivers all the time. And he says in response, these 2 went to the closing post and filled the other cars there. So imagine, it's time and money. So only driver A and B is allowed to go back and forth in the town. And then driver C, D, E, F, they're waiting outside the closing post. So they have to have these 2 drivers get in and out and then transfer it to other drivers. Doesn't make sense to me, and I don't understand. Do they think, okay, that these drivers that have been in there once, they know the way, so that there is less risk that they might get off the safe path? That's my only logical explanation for that. He says this is a good example for the absurdity that is happening. He says that the future of Viziz is good. It is a powerful company that can take such setbacks. But he says, however, we face the question of whether it is most appropriate to have operations in Grindavik. Probably not. He has lived in Grindavik all his life, and of course, he has fears for the future. And he says, as soon as people start building somewhere else, the future is not bright for the activities here. If people invest a lot of money in development elsewhere, you won't get out of it so easily. And that is really true. And that is happening already. So the government and the natural disaster insurance, they haven't really come to an agreement yet if they're buying out the whole town. So they're slowing down that process. But I want to tell you about a couple that is trying to get out, but basically can't because of the government. So one resident whose family basically has homes right there where the lava hit the town and burned down 3 homes. Basically, the lava stopped at their garden fence. It's absolutely surreal that the lava would not destroy the fence. So by like a simple wood fence, the lava stopped. They're saying it is so bad for the residents of Grindavik, especially because of the uncertainty of what is now happening after the disaster. And so he says the first time that when we could come home after the January 14th eruption, he says there was smell right inside the house. And he says, I didn't realize what it was at first, whether it was melted rubber or whether the pipes under the street had simply melted. They couldn't really tell what it is, but it must have been really, really bad. So you would think maybe it's the lava and the sulfur, but I mean, burned tires. So the way he describes it, it must have been really overwhelming when he came into his home. He describes their situation. He says his wife is not working right now, so she's not bound to any specific place in the case that they would move. They are left with a badly damaged, if not completely destroyed, detached house. The house next to them is the house where his daughter lived with her family and the husband. They are thinking about a move, and they have made an offer for a house in Thorlagshofen. But he says that process is completely on hold due to the nagging uncertainty about the government's decision on how they want to pay the residents out, or if they're paying the residents out, or if there is any compensation from the natural disaster insurance. But they're saying the smell is the worst of all. The condition of the house that they have built in Grindavik was absolutely not great when they returned. And he says the grates on the drains had burst open and were just lying on the floor. Everything was completely dry. And then I had already seen it on an aerial photo on some media that the street well had burst right at the edge of the lava. And he says one of the worst of all was some kind of burning or sulfur smell, which now lingers in all the clothes and the furniture in the home, a smell that his wife finds is difficult to describe. And this smell was the reason that they went to a Facebook group that has people from a nearby area, and they were asking how to get rid of the smell from the clothes and all the other things in their homes. And so they said when we came to the house a second time here last Sunday, a group of plumbers and inspectors came to the house, and the plumbers started taping the toilet drains. But it was clear that the smell was coming into the house through the drains from the damaged and useless pipes in the street after the earthquakes. And of course, the super hot lava that lies right in front of their house. So they said, so after all the heat that was there and in the house too from that lava, she says there's so much humidity. So they're describing that they really had anxiety, and the smell, it's not exactly the smell of sulfur that you find in hot spring areas. It's a combination of the lava dirt and dirt in the pipes and sulfur. The bad thing is they were told by the fire department that it is not possible to get such a smell out of furniture and clothes. So it seems they have lost all that. So they're saying they have all their clothes in bags right now, and they have absolutely no idea what to do. So that is really desperate, and I think someone should do something and help these people. He's saying, I have this feeling when I enter Grindavik now that the town is just useless. And that is really sad, but I think he might be right. And he says he really doesn't want to convince his wife to live there again, although it's such a big, nice house that they have built. But under these conditions, he says, I walked the whole lot that we have here, and I'm looking at my daughter's house, and he says, we can't do this. And then he's mentioning the offer on the house that they have made in Thorlagshofen. And he says, so we wait and we wait for the government, and just nothing happens. And he's not the only one. There's more residents that have these problems. He says all these purchase offers that the people of Grindavik have made, they only stand for a month. They're only valid for a month, subject to the government action. And he says, but there's no information, there is nothing moving forward from the government. And so he says this is terrible from the government. And he says even more things, so his criticism extends far beyond of that. And he says it's the insurance companies, disaster insurance or whatever it is called, they could start pulling their fingers out of their pockets. And he says this is completely unacceptable behavior. And then they're really angry because they discovered something also. They also saw that at the closing post, there was a tourist bus. And he says, you know, it's bad enough that the people of Grindavik have to face this uncertainty about it's going to happen to them and their valuables, their homes, and their town. And there's so much anger in people. And he says, you can only hear it from me, but everyone is so angry. And they're not happy about the decisions, who was allowed to approach the disaster area and who was not. So he says people are running out of time to go into Grindavik and pick up their worldly possessions, to be able to live somewhere else. And he says, and then you see in the news or on Facebook that a tourist bus was at the checkpoint and they went up to some geysers and fountains that are nearby of Grindavik. And he says, who is profiting from our misery? Is it like tourist companies that are driving the tourists right there? So here we are back at the topic of tourism and making money. We've discussed this in my last video. He's talking about where they could move and what areas would make sense. He says, we're still in a state of shock, but the house that we have made an offer on in Thorlagshofen, it is tempting because he says when you drive into Thorlagshofen, you experience a similar feeling that you experience when you're driving into Grindavik. And for us, we just want to get out of this area. And so we were asked why we would not be moving to Reykjanesbær or Sangerdi or Voga. But he says, knowing what is happening here and also there underneath the power plant, he says, at Swartsengi. And he says, you know, we don't want to live in the same danger zone. We don't want to live there. They want to live somewhere away from all this volcanic activity. And I don't blame them because they're thinking, what if we buy a house just a few towns down the road? And then the same thing keeps happening again because all these volcanic systems that are on the Reykjanes Peninsula seem to be waking up. And they're now thinking that it's not a good idea to build the new Reykjavik airport along the coastline between Keflavik and Reykjavik. They want to put in maybe some defense walls around Reykjavik and some infrastructure there. And there is evidence that lava from the Brennisteinsfjall volcanic system has flown into Grindavik. And we're seeing earthquakes magnitude 3.1 over there as well, just in the recent few days in the Blafjall ski area. So he is right. They want to get out of this, but they can't. So they're stuck in limbo. They stuck with real estate that they can't use, that is heavily damaged, but they can't move on. So the government is probably hesitant because they don't know where to get the money from, right? And especially the reinsurance companies might cause problems as well. And the natural disaster insurance doesn't have the money to buy out the whole town. So it's probably a question as to how to do it. And it would probably be a precedence because what if this happens to other towns? What if this happens to some subdivisions in and around Reykjavik? The state doesn't have the money to pay out all these people. So it's so much uncertainty with the Reykjanes Peninsula waking up right now, guys. I don't even want to blame the government too much because I think they feel kind of helpless too. Where to get the money, right? So we will have to follow up with that. And then there's another business, a business co-owner who gives a statement about what is going on in Grindavik. And he's absolutely unhappy with the closure of Grindavik. And his name is Ingvar Good Johnson, he's the owner of the company Optimal in Grindavik, and he's so frustrated that he says that the residents are not trusted to be in the town, and he says the government definitely discriminates against smaller businesses in Grindavik. And he says, of course, there is no child coming into town, but I'm also not underestimating the fact that the town is certainly quite dangerous. But he says that we are not trusted to stay here for some time, at least to try to save something. This is complete anarchy. This is just a state within a state. That's what he has said in an interview. And he also went to his company when the people were allowed to go for a short period of time into Grindavik. He went to his company, and his company produces chemical additives that are in high demand for the fishing industry that is right there in Grindavik at the port. So this company says it's very dear to his heart, and the situation looks very, very bad. And he says what we're doing is we're just probably moving everything, the production, into Reykjavik and just leaving from Grindavik completely. And he says, and then the only thing that is left is just an empty space here. He thinks that then Grindavik is completely lost, and he has lived in Grindavik for all his life. But what he criticizes the most is also the lack of communication of those who are supposed to be in charge of how to let people in and how to organize this. So I've heard that's quite often, that there is a lack of communication, and they're also attacking the police chief of Sudurns because he seems to be quite rude and like, no, it's closed, stay out. So there is not much discussion going on, as it feels. He says the situation is completely out of control. I mean, his workers were allowed to start operations back there on November 27th after the November 10th evacuation. But then everything has come to a halt again when we had the January 14th eruption. And since then, they haven't really been able to check on things. And he says the situation is completely out of control. And then he says, and this is like really, there seems to be differences how businesses are treated. And he says that he personally has witnessed some meetings with the Minister of Justice and with the head of Public Security, Vidya Reinesen, and with Olfa Ludvigsson, the police chief in Sudurns. And he says they were taking selfies with Vizzy and the Thorbjörn rescue team and someone else. But he says, these are the big companies, and then companies like mine, the smaller ones, were left completely in the darkness. And he says he has requested a meeting with the authorities so many times, but without success. And he says that the representatives of other companies in Grindavik, of smaller companies in Grindavik, have made the same experience. And he says that they haven't even received a phone call or anything, except just some nonstop tweeting in online platforms about the situation. And he says one of the business owners had a call, and he says from some fifth highest person or something, but only one call since November 10th. His company, it's not really that small, right? So that he's completely ignored is maybe also not so correct, because the company produces about 1,100 tons of these additives for the fishing industry. And it's a big export company because 70% of these additives are exported. And the company's turnover is about $500 million. So he outlines that they are quite a large company, and yet they're still being ignored. And then he also mentions the tourists at the closing post. He says then you reach these checkpoints, and then he has seen a tourist bus there. And he says there was a bus inside the checkpoint area, and there were about some 200 cars of residents. They were trying to make their last trip into the town to save their valuables. of course he was wondering why that bus was there inside that area and what the bus was doing. And he later then found out that it was a bus full of tourists who made their way to the geysers in the vicinity of the town. And he says, and this is what's pissing him off, he says, they drive on the same road that we're supposed to drive on to get into town to try to save our belongings and the stuff from our home. So they're causing traffic on that road, and he thinks that this is unfair, and that probably he also thinks that these tourist companies or whoever is doing this is taking advantage of their situation to kind of like have a sightseeing tour into the disaster area. And I also think that this is absolutely not right. Yeah, and that tourism industry, we have talked about it in my last video. So they have announced that the tourist industry is starting to feel some negative effects from the Grindavik disaster regarding their like bookings in January and February. So they expected certainly more demand, but also, you know, some of them are really optimistic for the summer. But you know what? I think they have other stuff to deal with on the peninsula right now, and that would be the residents of Grindavik that definitely would need more support, in my opinion. So guys, thank you so much for watching again. I have to say thank you so much for your supers, for your nice comments on my buymeacoffee.com website. Check out this site and follow me there so that we can stay in touch. That would be absolutely great. And of course, as always, thank you for the coffees you keep buying me there. And I hope to see you very, very soon. Until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.